Today on Acid Horizon, we welcome Dr. Gregory B. Sadler of Dr. Gregory B. Sadler fame to join us for a reading of Fanged Noumena by Nick Land. We use the concept of machinic desire to guide this discussion. However, we take various tangents and look at various aspects of Nick Land's work, its implications, and its impacts. Also, thank you to all the patrons who have provided both financial and moral support to us as this podcast has grown. This month, we will also hold a patrons-only seminar on the philosophy of Michel Foucault. We will look at his essay, The Analytic Philosophy of Politics. Subscribers at the $5 level or above can join us online at the time of the seminar. Any subscriber can access the recordings. Furthermore, we are currently supporting an art space in Louisiana called Yes We Cannibal. Together, we collaborated on a design for a t-shirt that they are selling to help support their space. I put a link in the show notes. Go ahead and check it out, or check out our merch store, critdrip.com. Also in the show notes. If you are new to our show, find us on Twitter, Instagram, or subscribe to us for as little as $1 on Patreon and access some special recordings in our patron RSS feed. Okay, with that said, let's get on to today's episode on Nick Land with guest Dr. Gregory B. Sadler. Welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory Podcast. Today, Will, Matt, Adam, and myself, Craig, have the honor of reading Nick Land's Fanged Noumena alongside the inimitable Dr. Gregory B. Sadler, a figure in the world of both academia and para-academia who has been a vital and precious resource of online philosophy education. You may know him from the copious philosophy content he has put forward on YouTube and elsewhere. If you're a philosophy student, or you have been, it is likely you have rushed to Dr. Sadler's digital domain for primers on the many philosophers he has graciously gifted to the masses. Thank you, Dr. Sadler, for taking time out of your weekend to make this happen.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thanks for having me on. And that's quite an introduction. I hope I can live up to a bit of it. I'll actually say something, it looks from the outside like I've covered a lot of thinkers and topics, but it's sort of like a spectrogram. You know, when you look at an element, there's all this black space, and then there's like a line here and a line here. And that's the way I look at the video channel. There's way more gaps than there is coverage. And I'm always hoping somebody else, because I'm a bit lazy, I'm always hoping somebody else is going to come in and fill in the gaps. You actually have to admire I'm sure all of you, know of and listen to the history of philosophy without any gaps. When that first came out like 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, I thought, oh, that's going to be tough to pull off, because anytime that you start working on something, you start finding all these other areas, right? That it could lead into a million different rabbit holes. And, people get tired of doing work. And so I was like, this might make it 2-3 years tops. And he's still chugging along, and going through each area. It's remarkable how much they get done. But when they get into like the 19th and 20th century, that's going to be tough, right? Because I don't know if there's enough time to actually explore all the 20th century thinkers. So,
well, the very first thing that I want to do is give you a chance to just talk about anything that you're doing recently. I went on your YouTube page and I saw that you now have a Basics of Stoicism course. Maybe you could say something about that.
Oh, yeah. So the Listenable platform, I get probably twice a month, I have a new platform reaching out to me saying, make your courses on here. And I did that early on, and then some of them went belly up because all of them were going to, revolutionize education. During this time, we'll talk about capitalism and, market forces and stuff like that. And we could actually use some of those as examples, these graveyards of digital content that are out there. And so I'm always a little leery, and I got into conversations with them. And as like most of these startups, they have kind of a skeleton crew of people, but they seem like they were, on point. And so I was like, okay, I'll try a course with them. And it was actually kind of an interesting experience for me, just from a recording perspective, because I don't use scripts.
Mm.
I do everything, I get up in front of the chalkboard and just start. I've got some things on there and I start talking, or if I'm doing a book review, I've got, maybe a page of notes total. And so I don't read a script, but for this, they wanted me to put together a bunch of scripts and then to record them all in one single marathon session so the
Wow.
sound quality would be exactly the same.
Right.
Man, is that
Oh, I'm
tough.
sure.
You get caught up and start stuttering or saying the wrong word multiple times. But writing a script actually turns out to be kind of a good idea. I've poo-pooed it a lot.
It's taken you this long.
Yeah, I mean, I see. I'm one of those kind of people who could get by without doing something. And then I mentioned being lazy beforehand. That's a kind of laziness, right? And so, learning how to write a proper script is, it's a good practice to get into. And so I did that, and yeah, I produced this course. And then it's interesting as well because when you're producing these things, you never know if they're going to stick. You never know if they're going to get traction or not,
Mm.
because some of these platforms are great at talking themselves up, but they're lousy at actually getting people to check out your content. And
Right.
if I have to post my content all the time, that's me having to do more work, and I don't like to do that. So, I've been very happy to see that they really have their act together, and I'm going to produce some more courses with them. The next one is actually going to be on something super simple. It's going to be um, words in philosophy that mean one thing in philosophy and mean something else in
Oh,
popular
cool.
culture, like Epicurean, right?
Mm.
Doesn't mean stuffing your face like a pig, or, being snooty about wines or anything like that, or what is it to be a cynic? And I think stuff like that can be quite fun to do. So yeah, there's that going on, and I'm teaching 2 classes this summer, getting ready for fall classes. I actually broke down and shot videos on the trolley problem article by Thompson, which I'll be releasing pretty soon. I've done trolley problem memes before, but I never actually taught the trolley problem in class because it's ubiquitous, right? So,
Right.
so I thought my Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design students would probably get a kick out of it. So we actually did it, and then I don't know what else. I mean, Milwaukee right now, it's a great city to be in. Some of you are probably aware that our team might win the NBA championship. They're going to be playing just 4 blocks north of here in 2 days or 3 days, and it's kind of pulling the city together in nice ways. So that's kind of cool to see. I don't have any hand in that, of course. Right?
All right. Well, just tell me one thing. What's the good bar or place to eat in Milwaukee?
I mean, there's all sorts of them. You know what you should do if you want to get the old school Milwaukee experience? I mean, it's interesting. We have a food scene that is drawing international attention, in part because of all the things that have been going on here, sort of under the radar. So if you want all the trendy modernist cuisine, you can get that here. But you want to go to a supper club.
Oh, okay.
Like a real supper club, not so you want to go online and if you read On Milwaukee or any of those other kind of magazines, they'll have lists of them, and then you just find the one that's closest to you that you can get a reservation at and pop over.
I was just going to add 2 things. One of them I need to get off my chest. The first is I feel like there's an entire generation of people whose entire introduction to philosophy was basically trolley problem memes. There must be a generation out there where they just see this meme and then they go, okay, but actually, is it a meme, or is this actually a problem worth thinking about?
Yeah.
The other thing, and I needed to say this, was I think this must have been a couple of years back. So I've been watching your videos for years, actually, and I've often sort of turned to them when I encounter some new philosopher, and I need in 3 or 4 videos just to get the basic sense of them. And so maybe a couple of years back, I was just starting to read Deleuze.
Okay.
Becoming really interested in his thought. And I remember, I think you were doing a YouTube Q&A or chat sort of thing. And I knew that in the past you'd expressed interest in sort of some sort of French post-structuralist thinkers and so on. And I remember I asked you if you were thinking of doing any videos on Deleuze, and I immediately knew that I was being that guy. I was being that guy that was like hassling you about like which thinkers are going to do videos on, when's it coming. So sorry about that one.
No, I mean, that was kind of a common thing in AMAs. I'll say something too. I like Deleuze as a thinker. I don't really like Deleuze plus Guattari.
Right.
I find him to be, they really loved each other. It's very clear. And Deleuze thought that he was a great influence on him. And I see it almost like the opposite. So I want to, if I did some Deleuze videos recently from essays, critical and clinical.
Okay, yeah.
And I'll probably do more of that and probably get into, logic of sense. I don't know that maybe I'll do stuff down the line on anti-Oedipus, but I just don't, well, we'll talk about that in this. I just don't like this freewheeling, like throw everything out there kind of. I think he's more rigorous when he's on his own.
I just needed to get that off my chest as a bit of an apology for being that guy.
I mean, that's the Hegelian answer, isn't it? Usually, I mean, if all the people who studied a lot of Hegel I see who've read Deleuze and Guattari think, he just Deleuze. And it's like, well, this Guattari guy kind of messes him up a little bit. But this Deleuze guy, I mean, he's basically one of us. Zizek, Todd McGowan, like.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you have to be a Hegelian to see it like that. I mean, you could just Deleuze does some really interesting history of philosophy stuff on his own, right? So I got introduced to him way back in undergrad and I actually did a video about this Japanese student who gave me a whole bunch of continental philosophy books. He was a rich guy. His family was in real estate in Tokyo. So, he had money to burn, but he was not confident about his ability to explain things in English. So he was like, here, I'm writing a paper for this class. And he wrote like a 70-page paper, and he's like, can you present it for me? And I was like, yeah, okay. And then he's like, here, you'll need these books to help you out. And it was, like Bakhtin's Dostoevsky book and Anti-Oedipus and some Barthes stuff and all that. And the funny thing was at my undergrad, so this is like 1993, the professors there had no idea what contemporary continental stuff was. They thought it was existentialism and maybe a bit of Marxism. And so it was a real fortuitous thing that this guy threw these books in my lap, because I wouldn't have been introduced to them otherwise. And then, I went on in grad school and I read the Nietzsche book that Deleuze has and, the Leibniz book. And I was like, well, this guy's really, really quite good. It's clearly not straight Nietzsche he's presenting or Leibniz, but the stuff that he has to say is really, really cool, And then there were Deleuzians at that time. And you could count on the Deleuzians to be like the really weird, wacky guys. Always guys. No, there weren't any women speech comm or philosophy students into Deleuze at that time. And, I'd hear them talk about stuff and I'd be like, I'm not sure if we're reading the same guy,
And speaking of weird Deleuzian guys, today we are reading.
That brings us to the book, and I know who Dr. Greg Sadler was, ever since I saw his first videos. And then when I saw that people had pushed Nick Land on you online, I was like, you know what? People were pushing, like, when are you guys going to do the Nick Land episode? And I didn't want it bound up with all of the online politics. And when I saw that you were engaging with the book, it was like the heavens opened, and I was like, this is the time to reach out to Sadler. With that said, we can kind of kick off our discussion. We centered everything more or less around the concept and the essay entitled Machinic Desire, although we're going all over the book. How would you present this material if you were giving it to a class of freshman philosophy students or sophomores? Like how could you even do that? Or like, what's the Sadlerian approach here?
That's a great question. I've been, I'm going to do a review of Fanged Noumena, and that's going to be tough to do because it's such a big book, right? Yeah. And there's so much really different content in it. And then I thought maybe I would pick a couple essays and do some core concept videos on it or something like that. But if I was teaching it to a class, I think I would have to adopt a different approach. Most of the students that I have are not they're the most challenging students. They're not graduate students. Graduate students are super easy to teach. You basically just throw stuff at them and have them do some presentations and then, nod and say, oh, you missed this thing over here. You need to understand this, and they'll lap it up, But teaching undergrads who are not philosophy majors and have no intention of majoring in philosophy and don't have any background, that's where the real that's where you really have to work hard. And there's so much kind of presupposed in these essays coming from multiple fields that I think part of what I'd have to do is like figure out what do I want them to read before coming to this that won't break their minds, and take up half the semester. But they definitely have to read a bit of Kant and some Schopenhauer and some Nietzsche, and that's just the earlier stuff, right? Maybe some Bataille, and then we got to start getting into like where's all this other stuff coming from as we get deeper and deeper into it. So we'd have to draw on other fields. What does he mean by cybernetics, for example? I guess it would be helpful that since he makes reference to things that are historical events and he makes reference to popular culture to like direct them to that, like when he's talking about Philip K. Dick, okay, that's kind of a known quantity out there that some of the students in a given class might already have some exposure to, if only through seeing movie versions of Dick's stories, right? So yeah, I mean, and then there's also like some, and maybe we can do some of this in this session. There's also some of like the contextualization, like what is this guy really after in writing these things, and why is his style the way it is? I'll admit when I first started reading this, and I started reading it because the publisher sent it to me because one of the people saw online that I said, hey, if somebody wants to send me a copy, I'll review it. I was kind of disappointed when I first started reading the essays because I was like, why does this guy have such a mystique about him? I'm looking for what the special sauce is. Like, when there are some philosophers like Hegel, for example, or Spinoza, around whom there's a similar mystique. People use the book as a referent without having actually read much of it because it's supposed to embody something, like the Phenomenology of Spirit for Hegel or the Ethics for Spinoza. Schopenhauer's World as Will and Representation, I think, is another one that people carry around it more than actually read. And you can say, okay, well, what's the shtick here? What's actually going on when we do read it? And when Hegel, nobody reads him for his great style or anything like that, whereas you can read Nietzsche or Schopenhauer, or even Spinoza to some degree. Once you get past the weird more geometrical stuff, you can read it for its weird, wacky style. But there's a lot of interesting, worthwhile stuff going on in the Hegel. And when I read through the first couple essays, which are a bit more, you could say, mainstream, I was like, well, this is just typical continental philosophy stuff that we used to do at, SPEP or other venues and publish in journals back in the 90s. What's so special about this? I mean, in Kant Capital and the Prohibition of Incest, okay, he talks about apartheid, which is, a bit dated, but kind of a cool application. But you say, well, why do people think this is such a amazing text? And then you read on and you start seeing, you get deeper into it. You get to like Machinic Unconscious or the essay that precedes it, right? And you're like, okay, well, here's where the Deleuze stuff is really coming in hard. Now it's no longer like Bataille and Schopenhauer. Now it's Deleuze and Guattari. And where's he going with this stuff? And I think that's something we really do have to talk about. Is this just, basically like the equivalent of artist statements blown up, cool stuff to say and read, or does it pertain to our existence, our future? What our possibilities for agency or self-development are? And I think the answer is, well, kind of sometimes it is, and sometimes it's it's blind alleys. I guess knowing why it's blind alleys is good, and then you get to kind of. I mean, this is probably going to tick off some of your listeners, but you get to some of the stuff towards the end, and you're like, ah, come on, like
Yeah.
the Zygolothic ex-coda cooking lobsters with Jake and dinos, and you're like, I see what you're doing there, but
it's very edgy, Mr. Land,
Yeah, well, it was edgy once, but if you've read Avital Ronell's stuff before that, she was doing lots of cool monkeying around with, the code and all that, making her books, non-standard sizes, and there's a limited mileage you get out of that, right? Whereas some of the stuff, like my favorite piece in the book is actually this one, and I don't know the history of it because I haven't researched it at all, but the one where Barker speaks.
Yeah, that's fun.
Was Barker a real person? I don't actually know. It's a great piece. It's sort of putting us humans in the context of the planetary development. Let me throw this question out there, since I don't have an answer to this. How did this guy wind up with this kind of aura or mystique that allowed it to become important, that he then moved to China and became a neo-reactionary? Why did people care?
You just made Adam's day, by the way.
Yeah, I have a lot of answers to this question. The thing about Nick Land, or because he's just a guy on Twitter now, Nick. The thing about Nick is that he came about in this kind of moment in which the internet was just the kind of thing it just started out. The idea that we could enter this new space, into this very horizontal kind of new online space of anonymity, which no one had ever seen before, in which you could tear yourself apart into these new personas and attitudes. You could rip identity apart. And during this period at Warwick University, he started up with Sadie Plant, who is a great philosopher in terms of the ones and zeros, her book, messing about with code, obviously a bit better in Land in some respects. And they were doing this idea of trying to experiment with new forms of culture in the wake of this sort of grand flattening that was happening in the wake of cybernetics and its growth into the internet, and new forms of electronic music like jungle and stuff like drum and bass and stuff like that. And they was incorporating both theory and fiction. So D.C. Barker is a fictional entity, but they're trying to speak something through him. They take a lot of influence from like William S. Burroughs and the idea of the ghost lemurs of Madagascar, and they had this whole thing about Lemurian lemurs, people from a land called Lemuria coming from the future to tell us about their god. But essentially what we get to see with Fanged Noumena is a man getting gradually more into this dissolution of himself through the internet. And then towards the end we get to see, and there's not really a way of saying this, he was on a lot of methamphetamines at the time. This is well recorded. A lot of amphetamines. You get to see a sort of descent into this self-dissolution of the cybernetic culture. And gradually, even his lectures, you see that there's these fantastic stories of his lectures where he would come in and just turn on some jungle music, start screaming into a microphone over some noise, rolling about on the floor, and then apparently someone stood up and said, some of us are still Marxists, and walked out. And you get to see this gradual descent. And there are some artistic statements in there. So Cooking Lobsters with Jake and Dinos, that's Jake and Dinos Chapman, who are friends of this cybernetic culture research unit. And they did the cover. But you get to see Land in this moment of great cybernetic opportunity where all of these market forces are producing the internet, producing cybernetic culture. Siberia refers to a chain of internet cafes, the first in the UK, started by a weird libertarian sect called the Revolutionary Communist Party. And you can see him sort of getting absorbed into all of this. And it's building up until he's losing himself in the fiction in a way that comes kind of predictive. And so you see this in Meltdown, because it goes it gives you all these years in sequence, then it ends at 2011, then ... So he's sort of playing with the Mayan prophecy somewhat. He thinks this great flattening is coming, this Blade Run society where the revolutionary replicants take over. The problem with all of this, and I think this is where Nick became more of an NRX person, is that it didn't happen.
Some of it did, but it didn't happen.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. But I mean, a lot of it didn't happen in the way that he's talking about. I mean, let me sort of like recontextualize it. So the stuff that you see happening in here, and all the stuff that you're saying that he was doing in these stories. So people were doing that sort of thing in Carbondale, Illinois, around the same time, and that wasn't any place special. That was just where I happened to go to graduate school, and there were artists who were doing kind of similar goofy performance things, and we'd host philosophy conferences where there'd be some serious papers, and there'd be some stuff that's you're like, well, this is clearly just this person working out their life problems using some theory in a rather arbitrary way, and then everything in between. And I think you can see similar kind of stuff going on in here. I mean, he's dealing with some really fascinating ideas, like, well, where the hell are we going, and does capitalism have any limits to it? And he's bringing in heavy hitters like Deleuze and Guattari or Bataille or other thinkers to talk about this stuff. But it all seems kind of flat and just strung together for me. I'm not one of those like, where's the argument kind of guys. I'm willing to like let a text go for a long time without that. But when you just kind of throw stuff together, I want to know why that particular stuff is thrown together. And that's what I'm missing in a lot of this. So like here's a from Machinic Desire, right? He's got this section where he says only proto-capitalism has ever been critiqued, and I was like, well, that's not true. It's I mean, we critique capitalism all the time, but I can get what he's saying in that we're always criticizing past forms of capitalism, even when we think that we're critiquing like the most present form. Like, if we look at if we get really granular and we say, all right, what kind of shape of capitalism are we in now, given that not only do we have insurance companies screwing things up for people's medical stuff all across the way, but hospital groups, because of deregulation, can become these gigantic entities, which then are owned by venture capitalist firms, right? So that's like a real question
Absolutely.
about what stage of capitalism we're in. And the very fact that we can say, well, that's what's happening, and here's how we got to that, and that's bad for these reasons, but also potentially good for these reasons. We are talking about a past form of capitalism in that we can formulate it, but it sure as hell isn't proto-capitalism, And then, like he goes on and he says, to appeal to extrinsic interests, aspirations, or bonds, to have an extrinsic authenticity, integrity, or solidarity, to authoritative community, tribe, custom, belief, or value. So I'll finish that sentence, but notice what he's doing there rhetorically. It's this trope where you string together all these cool words. And I'm not saying that it's all bullshit or anything, because they could actually have intrinsic connections with each other, right? But those have to be established. And that never happens in any of these pieces. And then he goes, is to rail against a germinal anticipation of commoditocracy. There's a word he makes up, flailing ineffectively against the infancy of the market, which capital wants to bury too. Socialism has typically been a nostalgic diatribe against underdeveloped capitalism. Okay, and so you can read that and you'd be like, well, yeah, that's true. A lot of socialists and Marxists are aiming at the wrong targets. That's clearly the case in a lot of cases, and that's why Marxists infight again with each other about what their target ought to be. I don't know about the commoditocracy. I don't know what that actually means. It sounds cool, but
I think I can explain it. To be honest, I think the commodity form is so. I think fundamentally all of this is a big critique of Kant. The commoditocracy is the form of the object as such. And his whole thing throughout all these pieces seems to be attacking the Kantian transcendental and the way it is fundamentally showing it's productive. It's imminently productive, but it's always self-limiting. It's always restricted by this residual humanity, residual form of government, which hasn't been fully.
I think by that time he's way past Kant, though. I mean, you could say that like that, and he does say that it originates in Kant, but then what Schopenhauer and Nietzsche are doing is adding to it. And with Kant, he'd be better to target Hegel in that respect. With Kant, you've got these essentially a priori structures that we can delineate, and it's all very static. And plenty of people have critiqued it and then said, no, history, where we are in history matters. Hegel's one of the first to do that in a coherent way. I mean, you can say that that Schelling is doing that and Fichte is doing that too. And then the question is, okay, what does condition where we are, right? And so by the time that you get to a guy like Land, it seems like he's saying, okay, all the previous people, including Deleuze and Guattari, who are still too humanistic for me, they're kind of right, and they're kind of missing out on what it is. As we go further into it, it's capitalism and then AI that's at the end, right? As the limit condition for us. To go back to like, well, what would you tell students? I guess that's part of what you could try to tell them, and then they'd probably, by that point, their eyes would be glazed over. Though
I read this passage, the one that you were just quoting from, about extrinsic interest, authoritative community, tribe, custom, belief. I feel like in a way this paragraph sums up at least the way that I read Nick Land's work, which is that in a certain way he starts from a reading of Anti-Oedipus and A Thousand Plateaus, but where Deleuze and Guattari are going to insist that every deterritorialization is always followed by a re-territorialization. Capital will, on the one hand, drain you of any kind of traditional religious authenticity, but then it will also find ways of rehabilitating those views and selling back to you, basically, in a certain way. If Deleuze and Guattari are going to insist that each deterritorialization is always followed by a re-territorialization, I think Nick Land is going to say, firstly, what if it doesn't? And secondly, what if that's exactly what capital does? If it just continues to towards basically absolute deterritorialization, and that's basically the point of the redundancy of humanity, the point of AI and singularity, and so on. It's kind of this reading of Deleuze and Guattari, but you kind of take one strand of it and go all the way with that, rather than the way they see it.
Yeah, I guess when I think about that and I try to imagine what these terms are referring to in social processes, I find them like super abstract. And the one thing about like total deterritorialization, that would just be meaninglessness. There's nothing there, other than, that could be a catastrophe that we wind up with whatever it's going to be, like total complete machinic desire, which has nothing to do with humans. But then who cares? We're not part of the picture. And the other thing, it seems to me like this with Deleuze and Guattari, there is this valorization of the nomad and deterritorialization and all this sort of stuff that was really easy to latch onto at a time that was quite repressive, and people would read it. But I think in a lot of cases we're like, no, I actually want some more re-territorialization. Like I'd like to know where the hell I stand, when I can't actually get a mortgage, and why is it I can't get a mortgage?
That was a lot of like Lacanians' responses to Anti-Oedipus. Is a lot of them in the 80s read it and they were like, don't you kind of want that comfort of your territoriality, right, within that triangle after you read this? And the model of deterritorialization is like, well, it's that of death, right?
Yeah, and I think this is where, like, again, there's a valorization of it, and I think it would have to get more. You'd have to act like, is this a good re-territorialization or a bad one? Then you have to figure out what the criteria for that are, and that kind of goes out the window. And I mean, with Land, it seems like there's almost like a fatalism about it. Well, this is going to happen, and whereas with Deleuze and Guattari, there's more of a let's do this kind of imperative to it.
Well, we were reflecting on, we just saw this stray passage from The Logic of Sense getting passed around on Twitter recently, and it really factored into our reading of Land's work recently, which, in view of what Deleuze says in Logic of Sense, I mean, either Nick is kind of just going his own way with these terms, or he made an error in interpreting Deleuze. What Land ultimately presumes or presupposes is that all that solid melts into cybernetics. What cybernetics will do and what the technical domain will do is melt down all social code and so forth. But what Deleuze says is there's a third term. There's a gap between the technical and the social, which is, and for Deleuze in Logic of Sense, he says it's almost like this interstice where the revolutionary lives. There's a space that between that which is deterritorializing and that which re-territorializes. There are things that we as a society, we as individuals, we as agential entities or what have you, we have this capacity to say no. We don't have to affirm this constant deterritorialization. That what Deleuze and Guattari are doing is they're articulating a sort of functionalism. They're not implanting any sort of ethical axiom as we might understand it in Kantian terms. They're kind of giving us the sort of blueprint, the outline. This is how this works. This is the way that capital works. And if we're forced to accelerate with capital, it might provide us with the impetus or the sort of deboarding point to take that schizoidal energy and then turn it into something else, rather than, okay, we just have to follow this thing all the way. That's not what Deleuze and Guattari are saying.
Yeah, and I think that there's many ways of saying no. Kind of reminds me of like in What is Metaphysics when Heidegger's talking about annihilation, right? And he says, it's not just negation. Negation isn't even like the most paradigmatic mode of bringing the in his case the nothing to bear, right? There's also refusal. There's sort of resentment. There's all these different things that one can do, and that's just in the negative range. I think when you think about reinterpretation of capitalist deterritorializing processes, there's a lot of ways to, at some point, it doesn't just have to be like the big money investor who gets to decide how these things are applied or worked out. People find ways to turn them into things that weren't intended by the designers or the investors. Very often they're just kind of swept along, of course. I mean, you think about like what social media did in suckering people onto it. And I'm certainly somebody who uses social media a lot, so I'm not criticizing in the sense of being Puritan here, but it's there to sell us ads. And we know that the algorithms determine a lot, and we have no control over those. But we can decide. You can still tinker around with your settings,
within a limited range, of course.
You asked a little bit earlier about how did this guy become this huge figure where he has this strange sort of early history, and then it gets even stranger, right? Because he goes off to China, and then he sort of reemerges as this sort of neo-reactionary figure, and so on. And the only explanation I've been able to come up with, which joins up the kind of the Nick Land of Fanged Noumena and the Nick Land that is out there today on Twitter posting, is that to the extent that much of Fanged Noumena is concerned with see where capitalism is going in the future, although we certainly have things like AI, much of the time, when you think of AI, like it's like Siri on my phone or something, right? Yeah. It hasn't reached anywhere near the sort of stage that even Land thought it would be by this point. And so the problematic for Nick Land, I think, becomes, well, if that's what the process if the process wants to do more than that, what is it that's sort of getting him away there? What's stopping it? And so Nick Land reemerges, and his answer is basically democracy. Hence the link over straight over into neo-reactionary thought, where democracy in particular is this issue of cutting off some of these processes before they can be fully expressed. I think that's the best reading I've been able to give. I mean, it's always easy to one option is just to say, well, there is no connection, right? It's just a different set of ideas. Early Nick Land and late Nick Land.
Could I develop on that just in the historical sense? I think there's a historical path you can trace on that logic. I think it's because you can talk about the idea of there's always a re-territorialization, and I think in sort of the failure of this great flattening that happens with the escape of the market into cyberspace, the deterritorialization was there in the creation of the internet and these new spaces, this vast, great new sort of jungle pun intended, the music. But it was re-territorialized in places like Silicon Valley. And I think that's where Nick has thrown his lot in with the neo-reactionary crowd, because the fundamental argument of the neo-reactionary position is, well, the only thing we haven't applied the market to is the production of states itself. So in order to finally unleash the market forces into their highest position, you need to apply the idea of markets to the production of states. And this is where you get the neo-reactionary slogan par excellence, which is no voice, free exit. You have no democratic voice, but you can exit anytime you want. And it's the idea of the democracy of the consumer. I mean, fundamentally, the problem with this is that it tries to reject hegemony, organization, governmentality, but it maintains the governmentality of exchange as such. But I think you can definitely see this element of democracy is this final limiter, is this final residual kind of humanism that restricts the productive power of, I mean, for me, I think it's the Kantian transcendental imagination, this thing which posits all the categories, all these syntheses, but then Kant reels it back to possible experience. And you can trace this developmental power, even through people like Schelling, in which it's no longer really part of us, and developing through into a will to power, the machinic unconscious, the desiring production, which is this intelligent, self-positing, self-reaffirming kind of technology, and then expanding it into all its lovely, marketable, dissolving frames until we get to the final re-territorialization, which happens after this book, which is the tech billionaire. And this is why it's such a popular ideology among certain strands of technological thinkers today. I mean, you can definitely see this trajectory throughout Land's book, confirming just exactly that sort of hypothesis you were putting out there, Matt.
Yeah, and I guess it links up with the chapter on the critique of transcendental miserabilism, right? Because this is sort of the challenge that he poses to. I'll say the left, but frankly, it's frankly posed to anyone who isn't, exactly on his side. Is well, if you think, if you have a problem with, with capitalism, if you have some leftover beliefs in Marxism, communism, socialism, etc., where do you go from here? Then, he sort of raises this, what's your route out? And I only really wanted to sort of set up that maybe there's a connection there between some of the thoughts we've already had on Land and that particular chapter. If anyone wants to chip in.
Yeah, there's a strange sort of tendency with Nick Land where, in preparation of this episode, obviously there's always a really important sensitivity you have to have with engaging with this guy, frankly, because it's important to contextualize his work around this more contemporary manifestation of his political philosophy. And what frustrates me when I read this, and it could just be my own philosophical insufficiency going into it, I find myself sometimes overwhelmed by the positing of all these different conceptual frameworks that he jumps from perpetually. And again, I'm not a give me an argument kind of guy, right? I'm a Foucault guy. I'm fine with these really continental things. But on one end, I am made to believe that the techno-capital singularity is already here, right? It's already being delivered to us by the model of the clinical schizophrenic as a conceptual figure that comes from the future, that is already decoding all of these flows, that already tends towards the singularity. But then at the same time, the human security system is what's thwarted this. The human security system all throughout Fanged Noumena looks like it perpetually can't do anything. It's entirely inept. It fails to protect the pod. It fails to maintain the Oedipal triangle, and yet it's democracy that stood in the way of this. For me, Nick Land's entire career is just conceptual framework failure after failure after failure, even in this more right-wing manifestation. I'm supposed to believe that this is what's preventing it. I at that level, I think sometimes I struggle to find it compelling, even though philosophically it could be very fascinating.
I kind of think that when we're talking about democracy here, it's being used as if it's a univocal term, when really it's not even an analogical term. It's got several different meanings to it, because if what stands in the way, I mean, to begin with, there's another thing I want to say. I mean, how the hell do we know it's going to be a singularity and not just a bunch of other rival things?
Right.
Like it's always been through history. Why this belief in? I mean, he criticizes theistic frameworks, but you can't get more theistic than talking about a singularity. Um, but let's say that there is going to be like some big process and AI is behind it, and capitalism is the way that it's managed to get its hooks into everything. Okay, great. So democracy, if we're talking about that in the sense of like, robust, lived, experience, in which almost like a Deweyan, like if John Dewey had his wet dream come true, well, that doesn't exist. It didn't exist in Dewey's day. That's why he was arguing for it all the time. And it sure as hell doesn't exist in our day. So that's clearly not standing in the way. And then we've got sort of like local operation of, what we could call, it's not pure democracy at a local level, but it's a lot closer to it. Like if I want to go to a Milwaukee Common Council meeting, now that we're out of COVID mask time, I can walk in there. And before that, I could get on their Zoom calls and be a pain in the ass to them. I'm not a Common Council member, but I can have participation that way. Is that what's standing in the way of this great thing? Well, that only exists at certain points, and most people don't get to indulge in that. So what is democracy? Is it conterminous with this thing that he's picking up from Moldbug and calling the cathedral?
Yes.
No, because it's not. It's not because the cathedral is just sort of like the elites, and then it trickles down and they get to tell us what to do. And that's not democracy. That's a form of all sorts of hegemonies. And that's the way our political system basically works. Most of the representative seats are not competitive. They're like soaked in lobbyist money and people who go to the right schools. And there is a political class that's got different flavors. And then you get mavericks like Bernie every once in a while coming along and thumbing their nose at it, but they're largely ineffective. So is that what's standing in the way? I mean, that the cathedral does get identified as what is standing in the way, but that sure as hell isn't democracy. So what's the boogeyman democracy that's actually getting in the way here? Is it that people get to vote on things that don't mean anything? I mean, when I teach business ethics, we talk about voting with your wallet. We get a lot more chances to do that than we do any sort of political vote. And that's much more widespread, because you could be in a totally non-competitive place like Idaho, which isn't going to go Democratic anytime soon, or Massachusetts, which isn't going to go Republican anytime soon. And you can buy your, if you're in Massachusetts, you can buy your ideological coffee. I forget exactly, with the Black Rifle or something.
That's right.
And if you're in Idaho, you could buy, I don't know, a bunch of Bernie dolls or something and line them up around your place. That's where you actually have a lot more agency. Is that what's standing in the way? No, it seems to be like part of the capitalist process.
It seems to be, though, too, that like to bring it back to the cathedral, land in the early 2010s will be pretty sympathetic to that whole blogosphere, right? And they'll play a big role there. And there are still figures that are popular on the internet that ruin many a decent grad student. But and so he'll be sympathetic, but like you still kind of get that here when he's just talking about basic market regulation, right? With a real ire in machinic desire, passing references in circuitries, and then clearly in transcendental miserableism. So I think a lot of it really is just there are all of these systems that are both completely inept, right, in the face of the deterritorializing power of capital, but also actively standing in the way. So it seems to be like a really strange combination.
Doesn't capital basically go around them, though, when they stand in the way? They stand in the way of one mode of capitalism, and then there's like some other thing on the side that comes in, which they're cool with.
I mean, I know Adam has something to say, but I wanted to just expand a little bit, because I was one who raised the question of democracy, and I think I need to say a little bit more though about that, because Land doesn't say this explicitly, but if you read and I don't recommend this, but the manifesto that he wrote about the Dark Enlightenment, which is
I read. That was actually, I think, that was one of the first things I think that I read by him, not registering that it was land. That's his sum up of Moldbug, right?
Yeah.
Last time I checked this, I just went Control F on it. There's something like 130 references to democracy in that. And the vast majority of them all at the start. Like his first question really is of democracy and how we can get away from it, basically. It's all about liberty and libertarianism and the development of capital. It's less explicitly like cybernetic and futurist and so on as than, it's less that than Fanged Noumena is. But that's the only way I can sort of try to piece together what's going on in the early land and then the later land, see there's some kind of continuity there. There's some kind of force which is getting in the way here, and he needs a program to be able, which is capable of getting rid of it. That's my own thought.
I mean, is the force there, if we think about democracy in a very broad sense, as needing to get consent of people and working that out through like deliberative means, right? Rather than just focusing on voting, being on juries, all those sort of like prerogatives of democracy. And we think about it more as a process. Is it that, well, these damn people with their different points of view, you got to convince them of things. Wouldn't it be better if we just got, if they were just told what to do? So you got, like the sovereignty principle, or if they don't do it, then you don't pay them, or, you drive them out of their houses, then you got the market point of view. Is that what you think is going on, or?
It's the first one. Because the whole, if you turn to the Barker speaks, Barker's sort of entire scientific thing is undermining what people think of as the need for subjectivity. It's this idea of the subject from anti-Oedipus. It's really just something residual that isn't particularly necessary to the actual power underlying it. And if you in the Dark Enlightenment stuff, his problem is that it's all about the voice. It's all about people producing, competing to brainwash each other. It's not really, it doesn't represent anybody. Representation is just a fiction, as Deleuze also says. And it's the idea that you waste all this time trying to produce subjectivities. And it's a wasteful way of doing it because you're still doing a market competition, almost like Joseph Valois Schumpeter's Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. It's the idea that you're doing a market competing for votes, but actually you're producing the voter. So I think his idea is, given that it's already a government corporation because we have all these lobbyists and we're just trying to brainwash people, why don't we just stop doing this inefficiency and just do it directly? You have a governmental corporation, a GovCorp, and you have any say in it because it's not trying to produce you the subjectivity. It's trying to sell itself to you. And you're like, if you don't like it, you can leave. There's still simple as. And it's I think that's where he's trying to go. He's a hidden hatred, not hidden at all, a hatred of the function of subjectivity as something that is always very restrictive and binding. And my problem with Land and with Deleuze and Guattari widely is I don't think they quite understand the plastic capacities or potentials of subjectivity, which I think you get a lot of that in Hegel, and as I tend to err on the German idealist side there.
I think you get a lot of that if you have a functioning family life, or if you've ever had a relationship, a romantic relationship that stood more than a couple months, or you relate yourself to an animal for a while, I mean, if this point of view that is being portrayed by Land and according to also Deleuze and Guattari, and I think maybe Deleuze and Guattari together, I don't know about Deleuze himself, were right, then we'd be like in false consciousness all the time. We don't really have any idea what's going on. We just sort of like paste together these bullshit subjectivities that are always in process, and none of our relationships mean anything. And actually, none of the media products that we produce and consume, like novels, plays, TV shows, because those are all characters who are subjects. None of those mean anything either. It's a pretty drab world, and it makes you, going back to that last essay, the miserablism one, he's got this thing at the end where he says, the transcendental miserabilist has an inalienable right to be bored. Of course, call this new, it's still nothing but change. What transcendental miserabilism has no right to is the pretense of a positive thesis. Well, who's he to say that? I mean, I don't actually. So he's criticizing the Marxist dream of a dynamism without competition was merely a dream. Yeah, maybe so, but that doesn't mean that everything is just utopian fantasies. And maybe the notion of like having a decent relationship with a other person, that doesn't have to be just thrown aside as, oh, you're being, I mean, here's the retort you give. Oh, you're being crazy, you're being silly, you're being naive. Well, there's me there, right? And we don't have to be like Cartesian, about that. We can just say, well, it's an intersubjective me, and yes, it is. I live in a capitalist system, and yes, I do live in a world that's permeated by the internet. But yes, I'm also still a subject.
Well, to be fair to the Deleuzians out there, I will say this is that, like, at least in terms of the family, for example, the risk, of course, is to succumb to the transcendent figure of Oedipus, to be constrained by that. And in fact, I think what Deleuze and Guattari want is to explode those categories to allow for the fluidity of the family subjectivity, but also to acknowledge what actually exists out there, the kinds of family arrangements that are actually in reality.
Yeah, I mean, Lacan recognized this. He says in one of his seminars that the Oedipus complex is at best something that applies to bourgeois families. And if we go into other cultures, we're not going to see anything remotely like this. And I've always thought, I mean, even Freud himself says, well, the Oedipus thing is something you get past. It's not, you're not always Oedipalized. I don't know where all these theorists got this, unless maybe the French, psychoanalytic establishment that Lacan was constantly, bumping heads with, were super doctrinaire about, well, I mean, like the stereotype, wow, lay on the couch, we're going to talk about how you love your mother. I mean, that doesn't seem to be, I mean, you can find families where there is like the patriarch and, this very traditional structure, but you got to kind of work hard to find an ideal family like that. Most of what we've got is blended together, and people where there's always like an uncle who's struggling with addiction, and he's like part of why your family's not working together well, and then you've got like political rifts and things like that, and yet people can like come together, and family relations can still be felt to matter. I mean, especially if you're poor, your family is very often your what you draw upon for capital.
I feel that maybe this is again one of those areas where the essay, the critique of transcendental miserabilism, sort of re-enters the picture, which is that one of the things I suppose we've presupposed here is that the ongoing sort of development and unfurling of this capitalist techno singularity, etc., isn't inevitable, right? There are forms of resistance, of refusal, of perhaps, in a utopian sense, democratic accountability. Try not to laugh. And these options are on the table, right? And I guess what Land is going to argue here is that if we still think that capital is within our control, we haven't caught up yet to where it already is, let alone where it's going. That would be I think the Land position is that it's already out of our control. And I guess if I was trying to sort of, defend his point there, I guess, isn't this the problem that for example, much of the left right now is trying to deal with, is that in an age of globalization where finance capital rules, national sovereignty is undermined, etc., this seems to be the question, right? Is how would we be able to subject capital to forms of resistance or control or refusal? So I guess I'm sort of trying to back up that there is at least perhaps something in this challenge.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think we can say that capitalism as a whole complex set of processes, different in different places at different times, we don't control it. We every once in a while we pull on a lever and we produce some sort of effect, but it is mostly out of our control. And the people who potentially could do something usually don't care because they're happy with it, or they've got their own little quirks that they want to do. I don't see that as that's sort of like saying, well, we live in a natural disaster. We still have options within a natural disaster, what we're going to do. it doesn't mean that we're inevitably subsumed into it as subjects. And I mean, we could say that like 99% of our psyche is the product of forces outside of our control, but we'd still have the capacity to do something with that 1%, and maybe leverage it so we can get it to 5%, and maybe there's and Land would be standing on top of that saying, you're not even entitled to that 1%, as far as I can see,
He gives enemies too much credit. I mean, I think the subjectivity is always constantly failing, like spirit in the phenomenology of spirit, eventually, until it gets to absolute knowledge. It's like subjectivity isn't even itself most of the time. And he's thinking about these subjects always being recuperated. And this is, I think, where you get Deleuze is a bit more optimistic than Land, well, much more optimistic, in that he's trying to seize these processes of making subjectivities, like in a similar way that Hegel's trying to seize the concept. To seize the process of subjectivation, the production of subjects en masse, and then really run with it. Whereas Land is like, no, this production is wasteful. He leaves a bit of this residual productivity out of the way because, I mean, and you can sort of see this in the internet stuff because you do lose yourself. In the rave, the jungle rave, you do lose yourself. And I think there's that literally an ecstatic moment of being out of yourself, which he's trying to tie into. And I think the reason why he's so big on the internet is because he ties into that affect of getting out into your screen for a bit. But I think with Deleuze, you need to take back a bit of yourself because otherwise you give the enemy too much credit. I mean, you do have a choice. I mean, I'm just pointing at me, but yeah.
It's interesting with Hegel's phenomenology. You're right. It is a record of failures and then how to get past some of the failures. And some of them remain failures, right? And it's also a document that is sort of like survivorship bias encoded because it only describes where there's been an advance. And Hegel himself thinks that in most places at any given point in time where a particular dialectical dynamic is being enacted, it doesn't succeed and people stay stuck at that point in time. And his philosophy of history is mostly, it's pretty crude and it's also, really racist and there's all sorts of problems with it. But I think he is right that, we get into backwaters, right? It's really easy to look at to read through the phenomenology and you're like, oh, this is amazing. I read through this whole dense book. Now I understand at least like how Hegel thought things happened up to about 1807. That's a real accomplishment. But you think about like, well, what does Hegel think about Spain? Well, Spain managed to proceed up to a certain point, but they didn't go through the French Revolution, and they're basically just a cultural backwater. What does he think about Italy? What does he think about? It's basically, the nation states of France, whatever's coming together in Germany, under Prussia, Austria, Bavaria, England, and maybe the United States that Hegel seems to care about. Well, I was going to say, so I mean, with Land going to China, is that part of where you're going with this? I
was going to kind of bring it back and say that there's a very apparent irony when we look at the whole history of Land's writing here in giving up and poo-pooing subjectivity whole cloth in favor of this inhumanism. He ends up affirming the most crass inhumanism that has underpinned the Enlightenment project and shot back to this eugenicist mode of thinking, a form of sovereignty that's akin to Hobbes's vision of the world. Is this really where we want to end up? I've cast a pretty broad stroke here, but I think that's what we get at the end. A valorization of a form of governance, of a form of domination that demands the subjugation of a kind of inhumanity. There's a very strong interpreter of Deleuze named Claire Colebrook. I'm not sure if you've looked at any of her work. An essay by her that I go back to quite often is one called Face Race, where it says, in order to establish the humanistic project of the Enlightenment, what was required was a subjugation of certain kinds of humans to be put in the cast of inhuman, as we get with slavery and as we get with a colonialist project. And that's exactly what we get with Land. I mean, he even wants to overcome the sort of minarchism that today's libertarian would advocate for. In the wake of not being able to achieve that, he goes full fash, slingshotted all the way to the far right.
This is a bit of a digression. So when I first read Mensis Moldbug, I was like, well, this isn't really very new at all. I mean, it's adopted for an internet age, and it's talking about some newer stuff. And he came up with his own jargon, but this is not different than traditionalism, post-revolution in French writing with de Maistre and de Bonald and people like that, and Lamennais. And it's not that different than like later thinkers along those lines. And the same, you say the same thing with like a more popular figure like Steve Bannon. He's basically Charles Maurras, who was he became important by writing the Dreyfus Affair and organizing Action Française, which is a proto-fascist organization in France. Didn't call itself fascist, but called itself integral nationalist, and provided a blueprint for what we often call fascist regimes, which actually called themselves integral nationalist in other places. And you see this with a lot of these, I don't know what you want to call them, neo-reactionaries, alt-right. They're not doing anything that's radically new. They're reinventing a wheel that's been around really since the French Revolution. It just takes on different terminology and different stuff. And so for Nick Land to lapse into that, with the addition of like saying, well, China is the place to go for this. It's sort of, I mean, I don't want to say that this stuff was like the voice of the future or anything like that, but it seems like a real, to use a word that they would use, a real degeneration or a real decadence. I mean, not that is a tangent. So.
Now's a good time that we can kind of start wrapping it up. I would like to know from you, Dr. Sadler. First of all, Greg, thank you for coming on the show. It was super awesome to have you. And in fact, I would love to have you back at some point for something else.
To talk about somebody who I'm more competent to talk about.
Exactly. Hegel episode, please. It's been so long.
Yeah, we'll do a Hegel episode, and you and Adam can
okay, cool,
be good friends. But what for you is the big takeaway from this? I mean, philosophically, ideologically, like what can we grab onto and like use in our own philosophical project?
Oh, that's a great question. There's not an awful lot here thematically that I can say, okay, this is something that, because I'm a philosophical eclectic, right? Sort of a Ciceronian eclectic. It's not a smorgasbord eclectic where I'll take like little bits of everything and somehow cobble them together and, like French bricolage. It's more systematic. So like there's stuff I like from the Stoics or the Aristotelians or from, Lacan or people like that. And there's very little that I can say that I found in here that's going to become part of my toolbox or is going to get sucked in, because it seems like a lot of the stuff that's particularly good and on point that doesn't have to do specifically with late capitalism or cyberspace is already there in the people he's referencing, like Bataille or like Nietzsche or people like that. So why not just go straight to the source on them? The thinking about what are we going to do in the next, in our lifetime. Maybe I've got another 40 years or so. I think all of you are a good bit younger than me, so you've probably got maybe another 70 years or so. What is the world going to look like? How are we going to make sense of things? Are late capitalist processes just going to get worse and worse and worse? Add that to climate change, which is going to really throw a lot of things into crisis, and the revolution of AIs and logistics and robotics and what he's calling cybernetics in here. Those are things to think about, but I don't know. You have to think about them through Nick Land. What do the rest of you think about that idea? That he's raising important topics, but he's not raising them in the right way.
The sources that he is drawing from, Deleuze and Guattari in particular, I think are important here because I think their philosophy has brought to bear in many ways. We haven't seen, we have seen capitalism cover the earth, much like a Sherman-Williams paint can, right? And it seems like there's no stopping. So I think as people invested in finding a kind of politics that are going to overcome the inadequacies of parliamentary democracy, of the kinds of localism that we're trying, and the abject failure of globalism as we see it now, we do need something else. And I think Deleuze and Guattari do offer some important tools for that. And I'll say this, in all fairness, you won't see me defend the real Nick Land. However, I will defend Fanged Noumena insofar as he is an excellent interpreter of Deleuze and Guattari, at least on the point of the body without organs, the death drive. I mean, this is like top tier secondary literature on that. And I think there's a way in which we can fold that analysis back into our reading of Deleuze and Guattari and people like Lyotard and so forth. And, you know, even carry the failures with us in the sort of Hegelian sense of things.
Very good.
I knew Adam would love that. But anyway, you know, that being said, I think there is something valuable for the readers of Deleuze and Guattari for sure. I mean, just Nick Land on his own here. There are parts of this book where I'm just like, hell yeah. You know, but then we get to critique of transcendental miserabilism, and I'm like, I don't know, man. You know, there's.
Well, I've got a thought, which is that I guess what I always take away from Nick Land, at least in Fanged Noumena, is that. So if Marxism, and obviously not every Marxist will necessarily agree with this, but if we take a kind of, if Marxism takes a sort of stageist view of history in which we proceed from certain determinate modes of production one to the next, and at a certain point we hit capitalism, and that's what we have now, and then at a certain point we, you know, raise ourselves to a higher level and reach socialism / communism. Obviously, they're going to disagree on even that characterization per se. I think Nick Land sort of asks the question, which is that if we've lost the belief in a kind of teleology of history in this sense, of this development through distinct stages, that then I think Land sort of poses the challenge of, and in particularly in the critique of transcendental miserabilism, what would a post-capitalism look like? Which is, I think that's sort of the challenge that he raises. Is that one of the sections about that chapter, he says or claims that the left have given up the idea that there could be a more productive, form of society, and that's why they don't. Well, we didn't want growth anyway. Now it's all about ecology and so on. I don't think he's necessarily right there, but I think it poses a challenge for thinking through, for anyone on the left trying to think through what is it that we want, right? What's the positive project here that would have to evolve? And that's the way I see Land, as a kind of antagonistic character, sort of pushing people like myself to sort of try and articulate what that would look like and think it through properly. At least if we've most have sort of left behind that sort of view of history. That might be what I see it.
I think it's simple. I think Nick Land is the enemy. I don't read Nick Land as anything other than that. I find, in a certain sense, that like Craig said, there may be some explanatory material, but I'd rather you read Eugene Holland than Fanged Noumena. Like I will push as much as possible against all of the tendencies that are present in this work. And I think that his intellectual and personal political developments are natural byproducts of this work. So I think Nick Land is the enemy.
So I've had a long history of reading Nick Land because he has a certain kind of aesthetic pleasure to him for a certain kind of, lover of the goth, let's say. He's a very gothic kind of guy. He's like the black metal in a way. I know black metal and goth aren't the same, but yeah, he's like the black metal of here. He's this, this evil dark side, which has this slightly possibly useful past that you can always tap into. And so actually, no, I'm reading the earlier Land. And there's certain things of Land I always love reading. I love his critique of Kant, because I like this idea of unlocking the fundamental productive power that produces the categories and then letting it rip and trying to make some sort of new civilization out of what the Enlightenment has always held back. I mean, I get it more from certain contemporary readings of Hegel than Land, but I think it's quite good to get into it. I mean, the problematization of the relationship we have to temporality is something we find in the critique of transcendental miserabilism here, but it's just as easily to find in Nietzsche's Das Zarathustra. Land for me is mainly someone who people go back to, or I go back to really, in looking at his philosophical descendants: Mark Fisher, Reza Negarestani, the Cyclopedia, the post-Exarchus milieu, which find their roots in Land. I think he has a lot of value in going back to them for that. But really, I think a friend of the show, Matt Colhoun, reduces Land quite well in summing up as the look for an exit. Land just doesn't like the world as it is, and he wants to find an exit. He doesn't want to find a new voice, and vote for a new party. He wants an exit, and he's willing to go into these very dark Gothic corners that become very aesthetically attractive because they feel like a total outside. But fundamentally, the historical moment has gone. The moment of Fanged Noumena has gone. Siberia was a complete and total. It wasn't the emancipation we all got. There was no great flattening, and in trying to found a new horizontality, a new end of governmentality, really he just remains in the hegemony of these kinds of fundamentally capitalist transactions. And I know a lot of people listen to this and think, we're calling this in bad faith, but I really enjoy reading Land. But for some people, Land is like your favorite black metal band. You can point out that they're all a bunch of Nazis who burnt down churches for years, and they'll go, oh, well, you would say that, wouldn't you? But apart from that, you read Land. I'm not going to say don't read Land. I think he does a great way of pulling us out a certain kind of Marxist logic to its extremes. Stop giving him attention on Twitter, though. He really seems to like it, and it's just kind of, he doesn't put anything particularly interesting these days. Stop recommending him animes. For God's sake, he has kids to look after. Let him just vibe, or leave him alone. That's So.
Greg, any final thoughts?
I don't actually have any particular final thoughts. I have a lot of things to think about, but I don't have any well-formed thoughts to sum it up. I will say, it's nice that out of the blue, the publisher reached out to me and sent me a free book. I always
Thank you, Robin, for sending Greg the book.
Hey, that sounds good, right? Robin McKay, if you're listening, send me some Urbanomic. We'll take a look at it, maybe even do a show on it. In the meantime, if you want more Acid Horizon, find us on Patreon. We have an upcoming seminar on Michel Foucault, like I said earlier. Also, find us on Twitter, find us on Instagram. Support us in any number of ways. We appreciate it. Also, check the links in the show notes below. Our next episode will be an episode of Inner Experience on the work of James Hillman and how that work is being used in conjunction with the idea of mutual aid. Should be an interesting episode. In any event, we'll see you next time.